Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney wants to create the world's largest trade alliance, which does not include America. Edward Lawrence at the White House. Edward, I'm sure President Trump is not happy with this.
Yeah, let's just say it has the attention of the White House. A White House official pointing out to me that 80% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border, and 75% of the Canadian exports come to the United States. That official also adding that it's in Canada's best interest to improve trade relations with the United States rather than fight sheer economic growth. The Canadian Prime Minister so far, though, going the other direction. Prime Minister Mark Carney negotiated a tariff deal with China that allows more Chinese imports into Canada. The Canadian Prime Minister leading conversations to link the Trans-Pacific Partnership 11-country bloc with the European Union 27 member states to create a rival trading bloc to the U.S. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith tells me Canada wants to protect itself.
Donald Trump thought Canada would blink. That was the assumption behind the tariff threats. That Canada was too integrated, too dependent, too exposed to do anything except complain, wait, and come back to the table weaker than before. That assumption is now under pressure. Because Mark Carney didn't respond the way Washington expected. He didn't only threaten retaliation. He didn't just issue angry statements. And he didn't build his entire strategy around changing Trump's mind. He started building around Trump. That is the real story. Not that Canada has somehow escaped the cost of US pressure. It hasn't. Reuters reported just days ago that Canada lost 83,900 jobs in February, pushing unemployment up to 6.7%, with the slump tied in large part to US tariffs on Canadian steel, autos, lumber, and copper. That is real damage. It tells you the pressure is not theoretical. It is already landing in the labor market. But here is where the Trideconomics lens matters. A country under pressure has two choices. Absorb the shock and hope the stronger power becomes reasonable. Or use the pressure to accelerate alternatives. Carney appears to have chosen the second path. Reuters reported in January that Carney is aiming to help lead a new global trading order that is less reliant on the United States. The goal is ambitious. It is to reduce dependence on a market that still takes nearly 70% of Canadian exports, and do it by widening Canada's options through plurilateral and bilateral trade relationships. That does not mean Canada can replace the US overnight. It cannot. But it does mean Ottawa is no longer treating US dependence as a fixed condition. It is treating it as a vulnerability to be reduced. And that difference matters. 'Cause Trump's whole tariff strategy depends on one basic belief. Canada needs the US more than the US needs Canada. That belief is not entirely false. But it is also not as one-sided as Washington likes to pretend. The US and Canada do not just trade. They co-produce. They share energy systems. They share auto supply chains. They share industrial inputs. They share border economics. So when Washington uses tariffs as pressure, it is not pressing on a distant competitor. It is pressing on an integrated system. That is why this is dangerous for the US too. Truth be told, Trump's tariff threats did not produce quick Canadian surrender. They accelerated Canadian diversification. And diversification changes leverage. Not because Canada suddenly no longer needs the US, but because even partial alternatives change bargaining power. That shift is visible in at least three areas. First, trade diplomacy. Reuters reported last week that Canada and the EU are working to modernize CETA and expand trade ties, including digital trade discussions expected to conclude this year. That is not symbolic. It is part of a wider effort to deepen non-US channels at exactly the moment US trade policy is becoming more volatile and more legally contested. Second, strategic positioning. Reuters reported in January that Carney's broader trade push includes efforts to expand Canada's links not just with Europe, but with countries across Asia and beyond, with a stated ambition to double non-US exports over time. Again, not because Canada can walk away from the US tomorrow, but because reducing single market dependence is itself a form of strategic insurance. Third, credibility. This is the part Washington may have underestimated most. Trade power is not only about market size. It is also about reliability. If the US becomes known as a partner that threatens tariffs reflexively, changes legal justifications under pressure, and forces every trading partner to hedge against its volatility, then even allies begin to build around it. Not out of ideology. Out of prudence. That is already happening. And the legal environment inside the US is making that adjustment even more likely. More than 20 US states are now challenging the new 10% global tariffs announced under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, with discussion that they could rise to 15%. At the same time, the courts are dealing with refund claims tied to earlier tariffs that were struck down after the Supreme Court ruled that emergency powers under USMCA could not be used for sweeping tariffs. That means one of Washington's favorite instruments is no longer fast, clean, or fully credible. And this is where the original script's basic instinct was actually right, even if it overstated the case. The US is learning a more expensive lesson than it expected. Not necessarily because Canada has already replaced the US as its core market. That has not happened. And January trade data still show that Canada remains heavily tied to the US, with exports to the US down 3.8% in the latest month and Canada's non-US goods deficit widening. But because pressure is no longer producing the old result. It is not simply making Canada more compliant. It is making Canada more strategic. That is a very different outcome. Now, let's bring this down from diplomacy into material reality. What does this mean for ordinary people and firms? For Canada, the costs are immediate. Reuters reports show job losses, rising business caution, and the clear risk of recession if no new trade accommodation is reached. US tariffs have already stifled investment and triggered layoffs. So there is no serious version of this story where Canada walks away untouched. But for the US, there is no cheap victory either. The integrated structure of North American trade means tariffs imposed on Canada boomerang back into US production systems, especially in autos, metals, energy-linked industries, and border state economies. That is why this has become politically awkward inside the United States. You are now seeing US businesses, US states, and increasingly US courts all interacting with tariff policy in ways that complicate presidential leverage. The old model of threaten, hit, force capitulation, is no longer operating cleanly. And that is exactly why this matters so much for the next USMCA review. Because if courts are narrowing or slowing the tariff weapon, then Washington's leverage has to move somewhere else. And the obvious place is the treaty itself. That is the real trade economics takeaway. The tariff fight is not disappearing. It is migrating. From emergency declarations, to Section 122 fights, to courtrooms, to refund claims, to USMCA renegotiation pressure. That shift matters for Canada because it creates a strange mix of vulnerability and opportunity. Vulnerability, because Canada is still deeply exposed to the US market, and can be hurt badly by sustained pressure. Opportunity, because if Washington can no longer rely on fast, legally durable tariff escalation, then Canada has more room to negotiate, more reason to diversify, and more time to build alternatives. It means the terms of the contest are changing and Canada is having leverage. And that is the most important part for Canada. This means Trump blustered, Carney outplayed him, the world took notes. Trump's pressure campaign is now accelerating the very thing it was meant to prevent. That is, a Canada that is less psychologically, diplomatically, and strategically dependent on the US. That is not a clean break for the Trump administration. It is not a quick reversal either. It is also not a miracle. However, it is repositioning. And repositioning changes everything over time. Because once a middle power proves it can build even partial resilience against US pressure, other countries start asking the same question. What if our dependence is not permanent either? That is how one bilateral trade fight turns into a broader credibility problem. And credibility is the one asset great powers always assume they have until they start spending it recklessly. So what happens next? The most likely near-term scenario is not dramatic triumph for Canada, or total retreat by Washington. It is something messier. And Canada understands it. More pressure from the US. More legal contestation inside the US and more diversification efforts from Canada. Which will imply more negotiation around USMCA. And more evidence that the old North American assumption, that Canada simply has nowhere else to go, is becoming weaker than it used to be. That is the lesson here. Even if Canada still needs the United States. But that the United States is discovering that coercion has side effects. And one of those side effects is that even close allies start building a plan B. Fundamentally, Canada is whining, America is learning, and the rest of the world is taking notes.